Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 46. To submit a question, totally confidentially, please go to our forum at meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. This episode is dedicated to Yosef Yitzchak ben Bracha for a complete and speedy and miraculous refuah shleimah. To dedicate any future episode, again, go to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive/dedicate. This week is the week of Pasha Vayeshev, and it brings to mind immediately the psyche that I discussed last week, but I want to discuss again this week a little more, because it's 23 years since the Rebbe delivered that talk this week, this coming Shabbos, Tov Nun Beis, where he addressed the issue of Faratzto, Gematria 770, Sarfas, the conquest of the Western world, the conquest of Esav, as I discussed in the last episode. What I wanted to add was that at the end of that Farbrengen, the only time ever on Shabbos, the Rebbe indicated, started a nigun, and they indicated lisrik to whistle. He put his fingers in his mouth, as he would usually do, a sign that he should whistle. Is a chiddush because it didn't happen on Shabbos. On Yom Tov, it was a few times, I think once or twice that I remember. And when we submitted the sikha to the Rebbe for Hagah, for editing, which he did, at the end, we wrote at the end that the Rebbe tziva remez biyodei v'tziva lisrik, and initially the Rebbe erased that piece, that ending. But apparently, when the Rebbe saw the ha'ara, the footnote that we wrote on that piece, then he crossed out his erasure and left it so it's published there. What does it say in the footnote? In the footnote it says, we speak about the union of Srika and its connection to Geula. That whistling is connected to the Geula. You can look up the footnote there. And also referring to Shabbos Pasha Vayeshev Tofresh Ayin Hey in Hemshech Hayim Beis, where the Rebbe Rashab talks about Srika Beruchnis. And we also zeichen there to the Sikha of Purim Tav Shalom Medvav, the famous Sikha where the Rebbe spoke about the whistling, the whole controversy, which is for another discussion. But the bottom line is that Srika is an indication of going Aris from Hagbolis. Like the Rebbe said then, Purim Lamed Vav, a fife from Kedusha, which essentially was the theme of the whole Farbrengen of Vayeshev Nun Beis, which was Faratzto, to go out of all Hagbolis, and to the point that we can also transform, not avoid, as it was in the times in the Alter Rebbe, but actually transform the world as we know it. And why this is so important is because it's so relevant to our times that we live in a modern, secular, technological world. The question is if it's a threat to our Jewish existence. Is it a threat to our faith? So overall, we always know Achdus Hashem, God created the entire universe, nothing can be a threat to God. And yet you find, throughout history, you find times where Jews stayed away and insulated themselves in order not to be affected or contaminated or in any way assimilated by the world around us. And this changed in time as we left Yerushalayim after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. A charity that God, a kindness that God did to us by spreading us among the nations. How's that a kindness? That's a result of because of our sins. But there's Kalkalos and Zeu Takanosan, as the Rebbe brings often about Simchas Beis Sheva and other areas. That means that even that our that which is our destruction is our repair. That we can repair even something that is destroyed to the point that you actually add something. By going downward, you go upward. So in effect, by going out into Golus to the entire world, we're able to be mavader. That's the theme of that sikha, that's the Vayeshev Nun Beis, to refine things from the bottom up. When Adam and Chava were in Gan Eden, so as the Alter Rebbe says in Teira El, it was like an avuka, was like a big torch that gathered and drew to it, Mamayla Lamata, from above down, the sparks from all over the world. Had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge, what would have happened was that the sheer intensity and power of their work would have drawn all the 288 sparks that were scattered as a result of Shviras HaKelim. Ruach Elikim Merachefes. Merachefes is Rapach Mes. That the 288 sparks that fell when the Kelim of Atikun were shattered. But since they did not, they ate from the tree of knowledge, which was achsaron. But that achsaron leads to an aliyah. Yiridat tzedek aliyah. As people began to transmigrate different parts of the world, now you start refining it from the bottom up. And this is stages after stages after stages, to the point when the Rebbe makes such a fuss about the Frierdiker Rebbe coming to Chatzi Kadra Tachten in 1940. What's Chatzi Kadra Tachten? The place where Matan Torah was not in a revealed way, as the Frierdiker Rebbe writes in a famous letter to the Rebbe, explaining what means Matan Torah is the Nish Gewen, in a revealed way. And now, even in Chatzi Kadra Tachten, we're also going to bring Chassidus. So you see this theme of going from a Mamayl Lamata approach, first trying to do everything from the top down, which of course is, in a way, the easier approach, the faster way. Slowly, as time passed, and we couldn't get it done that way, we go from the bottom-up approach, which is slower, more painstaking. However, it's more of a pnimis. You refine it from within, as opposed from without. Instead of lifting everything up, you go down there and you carry it, and you lift it from within. And that is the ultimate years of goals. That's the Zdakash Osa Kadosh Baruch Hu, that the Pizr and Beina Umis, spreading out the sparks throughout the world. We now gather it from the bottom up, where Jews exist everywhere, all over the globe, has that deeper the deeper power of Achdus, that it reveals the Achdus from within, from existence itself. So another shlav, another stage of this, was revealed by Yeshiv Nun Beis, when the Rebbe said the shinui, the change that happened from the Alter Rebbe to our times. That Yaakov, just like Yaakov felt that Esav recognized that Esav was not ready, and therefore Visnala Li'itia will go slowly, because we have to prepare ourselves, we have to prepare the children and prepare the sheep. As the Pasuk says in Vayetze, when it comes to the Geula, now the world is ready. And that's why it's so fundamental, because it tells us what kind of world in which we live. And today we have all the final frontiers, that everything is ready for us. All we need to do is elevate it all. So it's extremely relevant to our discussions, Chassidus Applied, which is the whole essence of basically taking Chassidus and applying it to our lives today, and knowing well, with a complete faith in the Rebbe's words, that people are all ready, the world is ready, all we need is to open our eyes. What eyes do we have to open? We open the eyes of Seichel, Chacham Einav Bereshe, which means you could have your physical eyes open, but you could be asleep. And spiritual eyes, wise, intelligent eyes open, means that you see reality for what it is, not the surface level, which is the whole point of Chassidus, the whole point of the Rabbeim, is to teach us not to look at the surface, but to look at what's the capacity, that which people are capable of. That's what the world is capable of. Recognizing that the millions and billions of mitzvahs and good deeds and sacrifices over the centuries, over the millennia, ultimately have changed the world, and that we're on the threshold of the eruption. An eruption, it takes years to accumulate the energy, but when it does, it erupts, not from something that happened that moment, but the accumulation, and the final straw, the final step, the makah b'patish, which everything, hakol helech achar achitim, achar gemar hamalacha, which means the end of the job, is that makah b'patish, where you just like when you finish shaping the metal, you give it one final bang. That one final thing takes all the accumulated energy and it erupts into a revolution of spiritual good that overwhelms the world in a positive way. Of Mala Ares Deus Hashem, filling the world with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. And hopefully this series of Chassidus Applied, MyLife, Chassidus Applied, contributes to that effort. And of course, every one of our work, whatever we do, in bringing Chassidus to people, making it applicable and relevant to their personal lives, is taking the world, in your personal life, your personal issues, whether it's emotional issues, psychological ones, husband and wife, spouses, family, personal struggles, whatever it may be, all the questions that have been asked and will be asked. And applying Chassidus is the best possible way to actually do the Yefutza Meinesecha Chutza, which leads to the Faratzta Yom V'Keid Mitzafeina V'Negba. Faratzta, there's the Kamati 770, the letters Tzarfas, which symbolized, as Napoleon did, the epitome of secular self-made man, the sense of the human being who's Keichi V'Eitzim Yodi, and even refining and recognizing that the Yesh HaNivra, which sees Yesh, that it's Ein Le'ila V'Sibur Acheres, that doesn't feel it has any source, it's self-made. That was what Napoleon represented. The self-contained, the self-made man that feels that there's nothing but him. That is rooted where the Yesh HaAmiti and Mitzuyusim Atzmusei, as the Rebbe says in this Vayeshev Sicha, that ultimately, that in each place, wherever there's a shliach, wherever there's a Jew, is not just to bring Eiris and Hamshachas from other places, but to build a Mossad there, an organization there, a shul, a Chabad house, a yeshiva, a community, that from within, from Umata L'mayla, from within that community, it shines and becomes a merkaz, a center of Jewish life. And then obviously when all that is done, it erupts into the Geula Mitzvah Shleimah, where everything returns to Eretz Yisrael, but still the entire world will also be elevated in the process. So holy whistling is essentially the theme of this week, based on 23 years ago. Five from Kedusha, the revolution of transforming our world, not only not to be afraid of it, but to recognize it's waiting for us to come do our job and reveal the Aleph in Geula and turn it into Geula. So it's about recognition, about transforming, not destroying, God forbid, but taking what exists and just recognizing the force within it, which is essentially the role of a chassid. The role of Chassidus is to reveal what is within, to reveal the elokus that is locked or trapped or held hostage within all of existence, and that's our role. So we have to be part of the solution. Part of the solution means that you don't become part of the problem. You don't become one of those products that now elokus has to be revealed in. You have to be an agent of change, an ambassador of godliness, which means that wherever you go, you don't become part of the problem. It means another person who's busy with money and covet and power and business, but that you go there and you remember why you're there, you remember to elevate it, and you're there to transform it, not just to be like everybody else, which is not an elitist position, it's a responsible position of taking what we were blessed with and remembering that we don't become part of existence, we are here to transform existence. That's the shlichus given to us. With that said, let us go into some new topics and some follow-up. There's a lot to cover here. So, this is a topic I wanted to avoid simply because I don't want to get involved in the politics of it. But since the questions keep coming, more than anyone can imagine, about the issues of Yechi and Meshichism, I decided finally, let me cover it, let's dispatch with it and deal with it. We've dealt with actually more sensitive material, frankly, but this is a topic that people have in their minds, so I'd want to address it from that perspective. And as usual, I will address it not from any political or partisan perspective, but from the Torah Chassidic perspective, as best to my ability, based on what I know from the Rebbe's Sichos and the Rebbe's answers and so on and so forth, the Rebbe's approach. Both Kra and Svara, things the Rebbe said or wrote, and things Svara, which is the Rebbe's logic and methodology, which goes hand in hand. And when you have both, obviously you're far more reinforced in any subject matter that one discusses. Okay. Question number 1. Since Gimel Tammuz, I feel uncomfortable walking into 770 and seeing all those signs on the walls. The shul seems to be controlled by radicals. Are my feelings legitimate, or am I the one with the problem? Okay. Question 2. Do you agree with the saying of Yechi? Do you think it's only for the crazies? What about those who wear Yechi yarmulkes? For that matter, do you agree with those who have the flag button on them, those who distribute dollars on Sunday and who make the shvil during the times of the Rebbe's davenings? I know these are controversial topics, but I believe that you can clarify them and perhaps give insight to those who are in need. Thank you again for all that you do, and may we merit the Geula shleimah miyad mamish. Number 3, question 3. I learned in Detroit for many years. Before Gimel Tammuz, they would shout Yechi. Came Gimel Tammuz and it all changed. Yechi became Chazer Treif. This bothers me a lot. The Rebbe said many times that Nosi Hador is Mashiach. Does this mean Becheskes Mashiach or Mashiach Vadai? Can Mashiach be min hamesim? Who made up this meaning of saying 3 times Yechi after davening? The question number 4. You see where it's going. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, an entire busload of young Lubavitcher campers passed through our community the other day. It was a beautiful sight, though I was surprised that every single boy had a Yechi yarmulke. Your recent talks about the importance of Jews having the moral clarity to stand up for what they believe have been very inspiring. With so much clarity in so many areas, how is it that Lubavitch cannot eradicate the scourge within its own midst represented by Meshichism? Instead, even in supposedly non-Meshichist Lubavitcher communities, Meshichists are very well represented, especially among the youth. This latter fact is particularly surprising since Lubavitch certainly has a lot of clarity about the bedrock importance of chinuch to the whole Jewish enterprise. Chinuch or chizuk, either one. When people stand up to say Yechi my Lubavitcher Shul, as occasionally happens, nobody protests. It is for this reason that my wife insisted on keeping our children out of Lubavitcher schools, which broke my heart, though my concession saved our marriage. But when those things happen, it's hard for me not to admit that she was right. There appears to be absolutely no clarity within Lubavitch on this issue, only equivocation. Rabbi Khan, Yelkani, means evidently has come out strongly against Meshichism, though I haven't seen or read anything directly myself. Could you please address this issue, or better, could you please take a stand? Question 5, can you please address Chabad Meshichism versus non-Meshichism approaches? And question 6, and there's a question 7, and that's where we'll stop. Even though there's more, but this will be a good representation. Question 6 goes like this. Shalom Uvracha. You deserve a huge yeshikach for having the courage to face such a burning issue head on. I wish to voice my own doubts on the subject. Right after Gimel Tammuz, I was convinced that those who fought over 770, as well as those who initiated the new-fangled magazine-based Mashiach, were on the right track, as opposed to their mistaken and befuddled opponents, and I supported them wholeheartedly. 20 years later, I'm less naive, more informed, and a lot more confused. I know that one thing that the Rebbe distanced himself to the utmost degree was machlekes, that any political dissension was repugnant to him. But in the present situation, it becomes almost impossible to remain impartial. There are 2 magazines, 2 kinusim, 2 mekemes tefillah, and so on and on. Things, if anything, become even more polarized as time goes on. So I ask you, where should a faithful chassid stand? Are the 770 upstarts merely mecharcher eriv, or are they upholding the Rebbe's true ratzon? Can that possibly be done through creating machlekes? Perhaps this is the case of kinus sofrim tar b'chochma, which means healthy jealousy adds in wisdom, competition. Are either camp right? Okay. And finally, question number 7. Thank you, Rabbi Jacobson, for these weekly classes. I really look forward to them every week. I'm so outraged and pained by the split in our community, especially with the recent kinus hashluchim. Why is there a breakaway kinus and banquet? Is there any solution to this? Or do we just resign ourselves to this situation? Okay. Now, as always, we are Jews, are a Torah Bavegung, a Torah movement, and Chabad Chassidus is Torah, given at Sinai. And it's not a political movement. It's not about emotional feelings alone. It's driven by a Torah, Hadracha. How do we know Mashiach is going to come? B'chlal? Because the Eibishter said so in Teirasei HaGadesha. He said it in his holy Torah. Had he not said it, we would not know. It makes sense, obviously. But Torah is not based on our logic. It's based on what the God told us will be. The Taryag mitzvahs are leseisiv v'lesigura. We don't add, we don't subtract. Not only don't we subtract, we don't add. Because it's not our Torah, it's not our mitzvahs, it's divine. So it's just like we don't subtract, we don't add. Chassidus is all about following what God wants. And God revealed what he wants through Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai, and Moshe Kibbutz Masar Yeshua, and Yeshua l'Skenim l'Neviim, and so on, until our generation, through the Rabbeim, through the Torah people, who Miyasid found everything on Torah and Halacha. This must be stated at the outset. As I've said a number of times, the first thing you see in any Sikha and any Likkutei Sikhas is sources. The hundreds and hundreds of Mara Mekemis citations, annotations, cross-references, references, cross-references, everything has a source. And when there's no source of yesh shleimah, that in the source you can interpret this way, you can interpret that way. This is the only thing that keeps us sane and sober and balanced and grounded. So there's a disagreement. It should be based not on people's opinions, but what does it say? Or is it room for interpretation, for 2 interpretations, for 3 interpretations? We once wrote to the Rebbe after a Fabrengen that we had 2 ways to interpret something the Rebbe said. So the Rebbe wrote back, these are 2 of, and there's 5, 6 other ways that you could interpret it. Shivim Panim L'Teira. So as long as it's within the context of the Midas, Shater Nidreshes Behem, which is the methodologies that the Torah gave us itself, the Torah gave us methodology how to interpret Torah, How does Shammai come to his conclusion? And Hillel comes to an opposite conclusion. They're both using those methodologies, albeit each one with their leaning or their personality or how they understand it. But it's within that context. And this must be applied to all questions and all issues. And the only way, as I said, is the way to keep clear and straight. Yes, I want to begin with machlekes, just as some of these writers wrote. There's nothing worse than sinas chinam and machlekes. The end of the Mishnah. Everything comes down to peace. And peace doesn't just mean absence of war, it means an actual confluence, a congruity, a synchronicity and harmony between individuals. Ein day saying Shabbos, we have different opinions. But you can have many different musical notes and it creates a beautiful symphony. As long, again, it's within Torah, with bittul, vezvav, v'sufa, even when there's a disagreement, there's still love between the people that are disagreeing because we're looking for the emes. I remember right after Gimel Tammuz, without mentioning names, and Askin, one of the activists, lack of a better word, Askin is more than activist, Askin is someone involved in public affairs, mentioned to me one Shabbos, right after Gimel Tammuz, 20 years ago. He said, now we'll see who the true Jewish mother is. And he was alluding to the famous story with Shleimah HaMelech, King Solomon, where two women came with a child. Each one claimed this child is their baby. Shleimah HaMelech in his wisdom suggested, let's cut the baby in half and each of you will take a half. Of course, the real mother immediately said no. She would never let her child be killed. So she said, better that the other woman take it. I'm mevater. It's not mine. That's what she said, even though the child was clearly hers. The other woman said, being that she didn't have the feelings, it wasn't her child, yeah, let's cut it in half. The story needs explanation, but the story is known. And as soon as Shleimah HaMelech heard that, he right away gave the child to the first woman, for obvious reasons. She was saying to me, let's see who the Jewish mother is, which means, who cares about the Rebbe? Instead of being right, instead of saying, I'm the leader, I know better than anyone else. There's no question that so much of these topics and these questions that were asked are so tainted and distorted by political and other agendas that it's hard to even distinguish between what's a political agenda and what's the emes here. If we sat down aliba de emes, which means without any strings attached, and just simply learned from the beginning, from Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, as the Rebbe writes in the Chayesara Nun Beisiche, Kefi Shemavur, how to explain the Torah Shebal Peh, and Chassidus, the inyan of Mashiach, including issues regarding the identity, I think we'll have far less disagreements because we're going to Torah. We're studying Torah and we're trying to understand it in a dispassionate, non-emotional way. Then once it gets embroiled in political opinions and who's right and who has the right to say something and who's the leader, who's not the leader, that's where a lot of our problems, both with the oil issues, 770 issues, and the outgrowth of that and the discussion that we're discussing here, Yechi, Meshichism, and so on and so forth. I still have not addressed the actual issue, I know, but I wanted to begin with this introduction because I think it's critical. And for anyone with a little seichel in their head has to recognize that not every time you hear something from someone, it's coming just purely, he's just a L'Shem Shamayim, just interested only what God wants, what the Rebbe wants. You have to wonder if there's other stuff in there. Sometimes many people, frankly, out of their ignorance, don't even know that they're just part of someone else's political game, and they're being used. And I say this across both aisles. And instead of it being a real topic, a Torah topic, because you don't see them kochen sich in Chassidische Sugi in Ein Beis or Samgvov or in Tanya or the Rebbe's Maimorim, dafke this. So Adarabah, bring the sources, let's sit down and learn them properly. Now, I know this doesn't address, because you're not going to find in the sources the Rebbe speaking about Yechi. So we have to discuss the sources in a few moments, but I wanted to get that clear. Let's just put that, let's call a spade, and I think most of arguments would be avoided if one does this. I can tell you for myself, I've been asked this question thousands of times. Do you believe that Rebbe is Mashiach? I've been asked by secular people, by religious people, by Lubavitchers, non-Lubavitchers. I'll tell you the real answer, the only answer I give again and again and again. And I remember in Barnes & Noble, almost 19 years ago when Torah Meaningful Life came out, I was asked this question more than once. As a matter of fact, the publisher insisted that I add an epilogue called The Rebbe as Mashiach. And you can read the epilogue. My position is already documented. I'm not one of those that people don't know where I stand. So I always say the same thing. I said, if you ask the Supreme Court Justice, do you believe in freedom of speech? What is it supposed to be his answer? It doesn't matter what I believe. The Constitution guarantees it. If you want to know if the Rebbe is Mashiach or not, the first thing you have to do is open up the Constitution called the Torah and talk about the identity of a Mashiach. Then study the Rebbe's life and come to your own conclusion. I'm not your authority. You don't come to me about other questions. Why are you asking me this question? Go study it on your own. And whatever conclusion you come to, you'll come to. If you're looking for the truth, you'll come to a conclusion. You have a doubt? Fine, so you come to a doubt. These things are all documented. It's not about people's opinions. If 6 billion, 7 billion people on earth decided someone's a Mashiach and God doesn't want him to be, doesn't fit the bill, he won't be. It's not up to elections or popularity contests. And if 7 billion people on earth say someone is not, it's also not up to them. It's up to God, it's up to the criteria the Torah sets down. The same way we have to approach the issue of Yechi and Meshichism, which I don't even like that name. I don't know who gave that name, where it comes from. It's not a name from the Rebbe, and therefore it's not a name from Torah. Therefore, I reject using it. I'm just using it because it's Lashon Daba. That's what people are using. So be it. If it means somebody who believes in Yud Gimel Ikrim, Pitera, like the Rambam says, someone who does not believe or does not wait for Mashiach every moment, then if that's what the meaning of a non-Meshachist, then so be it. But that's not the term that Rambam uses anyway. But I understand what it means in today's lingo, and I will address it from this Torah point of view. We've talked about mitzvah, avodah, and reshus, something that's a commandment, something that is forbidden, and something that's permissible, but not a mitzvah. The fact is, yes, Yechi was sung in front of the Rebbe before Gimel, before Chav Zayin Oder also, after Chav Zayin Oder. So it's hard to say that the Rebbe rejected it outright in the sense where it's osur. If it was osur, it would not ever be done in presence of the Rebbe. On the other hand, a mitzvah, unless the Rebbe said it's a mitzvah to sing this nigun, I don't see where the mitzvah is. It's a mitzvah to announce it. So it's based on the sikh of Beis Nisan Tov Shem Ches, where the Rebbe speaks about saying Yechi HaMelech adds brias, chayis, and life and health to the Rebbe, to a melech. So based on that, people said it, especially after Chav Zayin Oder, for obvious reasons. The question whether to say it afterwards for the same reason, maybe it's up to Lefi Hergish. Everybody that ever once said about Gimel Tammuz, actually, about saying Tachanun, he said, there's Toli Behergish, Val Hergish ain't Shayalim. Dependent on a feeling, and on a feeling you don't ask questions. So I don't see why this has to be such a hot, polarized issue. You know something? Someone feels that's what they want to do. I don't see an issur in it. Someone says they don't want to do it. I don't see a mitzvah in it. What's wrong with having it reshus? And then we have the answers of the Rebbe, many of them, and not only before Tov Shin Nun, also Nun Aleph and Nun Beis. Some people say there's a change of the Rebbe's position. Well, if you knew all the answers of the Rebbe, I don't know if you'd say there was a change. The Rebbe gave both kra, as I said, svara. Something that's merachik, that causes someone to be turned off from Chassidus Yiddishkeit, or may even potentially not allow them or say they're not going to come and participate, the Rebbe was clearly against. And yet you find sometimes an answer, or people privately, and the Rebbe responded to them when they called the Rebbe by this title. So maybe you have to distinguish, first of all, case by case. Number two, what you do privately in your personal affairs is one thing, as long as it's Eid Gehalten Al Pi Torah. And number two, what you do in public, where you don't control the message because the people who hear it control it, or others who may misunderstand it, or may be used against Chassidus, they control it, is another story. And I don't understand why that is not a factor. That's also part of what the Rebbe taught us, the methodology of how to communicate. And above all, it all comes down to what the Teitzah is. If the Teitzah of announcing the title and describing the Rebbe as Mashiach will help people add in Torah mitzvahs, so like the Rebbe said about Tanya, that the Rebbe Rashab didn't like when you say Pshetlach and Tanya. But if it adds in Yiras Shamayim, he was more lenient. If you could see it adds, and you personally see by teaching that, and not with an agenda, let it be an objective thing that someone actually sees it. So case by case. And in situations where there's a doubt, there's the answer after answer from the Rebbe, which I have many of them, then I do not see why a person has to go ahead and insist and do something that may or may not be of help. I want to just pull out something, if I may. Actually, it's not from this. This is the next topic. We'll address that soon. So this is my job is not to take a stand on these matters. I'm not planning to take a stand. I'm not a pesach. I'm a simple Jew who's trying to convey the ideas that the Rebbe shared with us, both of what he's written and what he said, and the methodology and logic behind it all. So bottom line, it all comes down to the positivity of helping people, prepare them to become closer to God, closer to Chassidus, Yiddishkeit and Chassidus, more shem re'teira mitzvahs, and be ready to be Mekabel Mashiach. Most people in this world don't even know what the word means. It's not just a word. It means accepting the authority, the Rav and Melech, the authority and the education and the approach of this teacher. If that's what you're teaching people, above all, let's not forget the most important thing. The Gula Mitzvah shleimah is something that needs to be explained. Part of that is that there'll be an individual that leads the world and inspires the world, etc. To explain it, you have to explain the whole subject matter. To just go into a quick fix and say, here's the identity of the person, is frankly not necessarily, in most cases, the way that you're going to explain anything to anyone. And actually make them warm and open to and receptive to it. Because you need to be able to understand, what is this, why should I wait for this Mashiach? And in Judaism, Mashiach is not just a person appearing. It's a chefza that has also a gavra in it. And yeshemrim, that the chefza, which is the Indian of Geula and what it is and how it will change the world and change us. Molor is deis Hashem. And instead of material pursuits, will be, as an end in itself, it will be a means to a spiritual end. That is above all the real essence of what Geula is. In that, as Eibishter, just like he chose a Moshe Rabbeinu to take the Jews out of Mitzrayim, Goyal Rishon, Goyal Ach, and he chooses a Mashiach to take the Eden and the world out of this Golus. And that's the bottom line and the punchline in all that needs to be discussed. Sadly, once Machlekes enters into the picture, everything gets distorted. You can't even talk about things in any normal way, because then it comes down to everybody says the other person is the problem. And we go back, who is the mother here? Maybe it's time for some people to say, you know what, it's more important that the child be intact and not create a chil Hashem than me being right and me being in control or in power. I think enough said on this topic. I hope it answers all the questions. I'm just looking quickly here. As you see, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of stuff. And people have to look at it in an honest and straightforward way. And if we do it that way, I think we'll be fine. Not just fine, we'll actually bring the Geula as closely as possible. As far as the different approaches to things, as long as it's within the context of Torah and there's no machlekes involved, so be it. Let two people learn a sikha and understand pshat. The Rebbe does say in sikhas that the Nasi Ador is Mashiach Shebedor, but he brings a Maramokim for it, Chasam Sefer and other Maramokims. So the question how that's interpreted and how it's used and how it's publicized and what ultimate impact it has on the people that hear it and how they hear it. That needs to be taken into account. So emes is emes, but as the Rebbe wrote to a number of Askonim, emes has to be presented in a way that people can hear it, that will bring them closer to the ideas and to ultimately stimulate them and motivate them to do something, an action that will bring the Geula b'poel mamash. Okay. Let's go to the next. Activism versus Avodah pnimis. Okay. Chabad began as an introspective system starting with Alter Rebbe, who focused on working on our pnimis selves, on our inner selves, our emotions and our mindsets. However, it seems that the Rebbe moved Chassidus, shift Chassidus away from working on ourselves and instead turned the movement into Chabad activism, which is essentially the core of shlichus. Is it true that today the stress is more on saving the world, leaving us no time or little time to learn and daven properly? Did the Rebbe shift the focus of Chabad from internal work, personal refinement, learning and davening, to working with others? Okay, the answer is unequivocally no. Let's just start with that. Loi mitan aleph. Absolutely not. First of all, Chaz v'shalom to say the Rebbe shifted any Chassidus Chabad anywhere. The Rabbeim are all one thing. Chassidus Chabad is the essence of your Futzah Manesecha Chutza, which will bring Osimar, the Malka Mashiach Mashiach. The question is what form it takes, and perhaps elements that need emphasis because of the times. But God forbid to say any shifts. So let's Let's spell it out. Yes, it's true in the time of the Alter Rebbe there was a Cheder Rishon, a Cheder Sheni. These are high standards for the people to enter the inner circle, inner sanctum of the Alter Rebbe. They needed to know Shas and Poskim, Rishenim, Achrenim, Nevuchim, Kuzri, etc., etc. Cheder Sheni, the requirements were a little less, but also pretty intense. And in general, it wasn't just everybody goes to the top. The inner circle were people of the highest caliber. As the generations went from there, you see maybe those standards lowered. The Rebbe Rashab started Temchet Mim. Temchet Mim then had real standards. It wasn't so simple. Not every student was let in. The Rebbe, you can say, broadened the net, especially Shluchis. You could say, well, he didn't make any conditions. You don't even have to necessarily have a knowledge in a particular area, be a master. There's no tests. If you want to be dedicated to doing the Rebbe's work, you can go out on Shluchis. This does not mean a lowering of standards. Perhaps a few things have to be taken into account. Number one, the Alter Rebbe did not deal with a world of assimilated world of an intermarriage. Even if there existed, which rarely existed at the time, it was not in his reach even. It was not the circles he was reaching. Today, unfortunately, it's an epidemic. A fire is burning. And as the Rebbe said about the Frierdiker Rebbe once, the Mesiris Nefesh, as a Rebbe gedaft zu avegita weg von the tiefste inyanim askola and aveda in Chassidus, to go teach Aleph Beis, a child in America, is a tremendous Mesiris Nefesh. But that becomes a necessity due to the times. Pekuach Nefesh. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it's a shift. It means that's how Chassidus is being translated today. And together with that requires knowledge. There's an answer. Let me read from you an answer that I saw recently. Answer from the Rebbe. In the early memes. Another answer. In the Yechidus from Tov Shech Chav Zayin, Bechlal, Kasher Miskenim, B'shas Mevil Zayin HaShliach, oder Ha'esek B'tzorchit Tzibur, darf man früher wissen, wie zu gut lernen, Nigla, Chassidus. Und befragt today, Hadova Choshev B'miyuchad. Any Farbrengen, look at a Farbrengen. Even the Farbrengens where the Rebbe came out with the biggest proclamations of activism, quote unquote. Miftzat Film, Miftzat Mezuzah, the other Miftzayim. All the activism that we're talking about. Tell me how those sikhs were delivered. If you didn't know better, you'd think the Rebbe came out, hey my friends, today we're launching Miftzat Film. Every Jewish boy, a man, after Bar Mitzvah, to put on film every weekday. It's not how it happened. It starts with a whole Sikha and Arichas and Nigla and Chassidus and Arashi and Azoyar about what film is. And at the end of the Sikha, Hamaiso Iker, Teira Meloshna Hera, all this comes down to this and this directive. Every Farbrengens are all Teira. And through the Teira comes to an activist thing. So if anybody wants to know the Rebbe's approach is always Teira and deep Teira. You could say, why didn't he first say the action? Say the action, now we'll explain it. No. Everything is that way. So the Rebbe's approach, everything is Kulei Teira, Limud HaTeira. However, to stop a Jew from putting on film and say, listen, let's learn all Hilchos film. Obviously, meeting him in the street on Mivtzoyim, a tank, is not going to work. So right now, let's get him a Ma'aseh and get the film. The next step is, that will get him intrigued. Mitzvah gereres mitzvah, want to learn more, want to do more mitzvahs. It's a matter of a method. That method in the Alter Rebbe's times, as I said before, was maybe more Mamayla Lamat. Meaning first Talmid Chacham and the whole thing. Eris. Today, because of the matzav and the situation, Vilda Zeit, you need Vilda approaches sometimes, as the Rebbe said about a mitzvah tank. Not that it shifted anything away. The Rebbe wanted Shluchim and every one of his emissaries and every one of his Askani Tzibur to learn and daven. And clearly many times he says that will add hatzlach in your shlichus, not the opposite. The fact that some people may be lazy, or some people may be so overwhelmed, so they focus on the fundraising, or on the activism, that's their thing. There's nothing to do with the Rebbe. Was schleppt mir rein in them? The Rebbe said once in a Yechidus to somebody. The Rebbe once said in a Kvisit, where's the Kvisit in the Torah? He says, the real challenge I have is, one second. The Rebbe says the real challenge is Mishlet Mirarein in them. Because I say you should go out and be activists, so I'm at fault that you're not doing anything. That's not what I want. I want you to do it with Kfisit and the Torah. And I think everyone in an honest heart will know that to learn every morning an hour, a half hour, is not going to in any way compromise your shlichus. We waste enough time in Rahman al-Islam with other things. So to do that, if anything, will give you more dynamic energy, more chayis, more pnimis. So b'meila, the answer is nothing has shifted. It's just we have time today that certain things are unique, and we have to do what we have to do, but the Avodah pnimis is absolutely necessary, perhaps in a different form, but the same thing is necessary. Okay. That said. Now, by the way, the Yechidus I read from, the Yechidus Tov Shalamed Zayin. Okay. Let's now go over to the next question, which is some follow-ups to things we've already discussed. Three issues. First of all, the issue of davening. Let's start with that, and then we'll go to the others. How to daven. So I quoted last week, a Maimer, Inyan Hatfilah Ve'izbonus from Rab Hillel Paritcher. And I only read the first half, which was what he heard from the Mittler Rebbe. What he asked the Mittler Rebbe was, the question was, that the whole point of davening is to be bottled to the Eibishter. Shavisi Hashem lenegdi samid. And so what is the connection between the Kavone Protis of the Pirush HaMilas, that every level, Baruch Sha'amar is Radlah, etc., to this bittul? In different asias, Elov v'leila midosav, it says. Chol karanu Hashem elov v'leila midosav. The Pardes brings from the Sifri. To daven to the Eibishter, not to his midas, Chaz v'shalom. You're not davening to the Sfiris. You're davening to the Eibishter himself. That's the kavanah. So why isn't the gay to know all the midas prat? And the Mittler Rebbe's answer was that you have to be mizbein and say the ishtalshus, but derech prat before davening. When you do that, you align all the details to the klal, which is the Eibishter. And then when you daven with Chassidus, the meaning of Pirush HaMilas, then there will not be a contradiction between the details of the midas and a love. So it's his bonus before davening that creates the connection between details. Why do you need details? So we know, as the Mittler Rebbe writes in Shari Yichud, in the whole Shari Yichud is based on that as they say, God's in the details. To think in general that there's a God is very nice, but to really make it come home, you have to see it in the details of your life and details of Seder Shtalshus. So that is Bananus, he says, comes before davening. And then you can apply that, because now that you've aligned the details in your contemplation, when you actually daven, the details are not divorced from, but they're connected to a love, v'leila midesa. The Rabbi Hillel then goes on and says, after he explains this, Alpi Chassidus and Kabbalah, he says the following, which is, I think, very interesting. Ach yesh eid derech Yesu geveya. There's another way in davening which is greater. V'hu nitzach l'neshamas nemuchim daika. And this is what's needed specifically for lower souls. A higher approach for lower souls, referring to souls not like in the Mittler Rebbe's times, but coming closer to our times. That's why following up this to the previous discussion on activism and Avodah pnimis. V'hu masha shamaiti ma'admur shlita, that Rebbe Hillel says, and that's what I heard from the Rebbe. Admur shlita is referring out to the Tzemach Tzedek, not the Mittler Rebbe. Lachshav teira mikisvei Chassidus keseder. To think teira from the writings of Chassidus keseder. Keseder needs interpretation what that means, but that's what he writes. It apparent his kavanah is gamkin al kedem atfil, like just like the Mittler Rebbe said, that you need the bonus of all the details of Seder Shtalshus before davening. This is before davening. Ubeis atfil lachshav Pirush HaMilas, and during davening to think of the Pirush HaMilas, the specifics. So then, what's the point of the machshavas Chassidus beforehand? That would give strength and fortitude to feel a chayes and nefesh when he davens in the Pirush HaMilas. to the point that he could feel a vitality in the words of davening. And through that, automatically will be an elevation b'chlal in the whole of Seder Shtalshus, b'frat his soul to Ein Sof. What is the difference between the Mittler Rebbe's approach and Tzemach Tzedek? The Mittler Rebbe, it says bonus, he says, not a machshove. And Mittler Rebbe, it says bonus in all the details of Seder Shtalshus. Anoshim Kerkenu, like the Alter Rebbe says, and I believe in Perek Mem Beis, not everybody has that time and patience. It comes that Tzemach Tzedek says, for neshamas, nemuchim, lower neshamas, that don't have the ability to sit and spend time contemplating on every step of Ishtalshus and how it's connected to the divine source, they have to do is learn Inyan Chassidus. Keseder. It doesn't have to be, in other words, the whole Seder Ishtalshus. You don't have to figure all the pratim out. Learn a Chassidus. Connect to something that gives you a Hergesh Aliki, something divine. And then that will automatically infuse the Pirush Hamilas when you daven with a whole different vitality. So much can be said about all of this. I just refer, for those that want to look a little deeper into it, well, let's refer you to a few Maramekemis here. Because these ideas, as you probably know, those who are familiar with Chassidus know, are not just here Rab Hiller's written, that Mittler Rebbe, Imre Bina, the Hagdama to Imre Bina, goes and speaks a whole thing about the Protei Kavana is very similar to the answer to Rab Hillel. So that's one reference. That's similar to what Rab Hillel from Mittler Rebbe sounds very much like what the Mittler Rebbe writes in the Hagdama, the introduction to Imre Bina. That's one thing I want to refer you to. The next thing I want to refer you to is, of course, Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah. This is the Tzemach Tzedek. The whole beginning of it, Tzemach Tzedek, Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah, and continues on, is the idea of a love v'leil midesav. How you align your focus on the details to making sure ani mispal l'daze hatinuk, like the Shalos Shavis Rivash that he brings there, about that I mispal l'daze hatinuk, which means they love mamish to God Himself, and yet, as we become more sophisticated and we have an understanding of the details of life, even those details are chaz v'shalom, God forbid, to daven to the memutzayim, to the garzim biyad hachetziv, to the axe in the hand of the axeman. It's only to be able to focus on the details of how a love manifests in our personal lives. It manifests in these in chesed and gvura teferes, but never, God forbid, to replace it. The focus is always to the love. So the Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah, the beginning, then Perek Yud Aleph, and where else? Perek and other places. And then there's, of course, Kuntras HaTefillah and Kuntras HaAvodah of the Rebbe Rashab. So in Kuntras HaTefillah, chapter 16, he talks also about those that don't have the proper details of the whole Seder Shtalshus, how they should learn a Maimon and how you should daven. And in Kuntras HaAvodah, the Rebbe Rashab also in chapter 6 discusses this as well. So little sources to elaborate on this topic. And now I think I've said enough about it for this for now. If you have more questions, feel free to write again to meaningfullife.com/MyLife live. Okay. Another follow-up was questions about autism and special children. So let me put this aside. Autism and special children. And here was the question. Can you elaborate more on what the Rebbe Chassidus says about special children with sources as you normally do? Thanks. Okay, yes, that's appropriate. I did cite a few things without actually reading or citing where the letter was. There's one particular letter I'd like to bring everybody's attention to, and that's a letter I saw published a long time ago, a letter by the Rebbe to Dr. R. Wilkes, chairman of the Region 2 Council for Mental Retardation in New York. The letter is dated, I believe, I think recently, just now, has been publicized again, but I happen to have it from back then. It was dated 22 of Tovshin Lamed Tes, right, to Dr. R. Wilkes. It's a longer letter, and anybody who wants to see the entire letter, please send us an email, but send us with your email address, not anonymous, or I cannot send back a response. So you can send it to simon@meaningfullife.com, to wisdomreb@meaningfullife.com, to anything, contact@meaningfullife.com, and we'll send you the letter. Basically, the Rebbe writes, this is in reply to your letter of August 9th, in which you asked for my views on the care and education of Jewish retarded children, outlining some of the problems connected therewith and prevailing policies. I must first of all make one essential observation, namely, that while the above heading places all the retarded in one group, it would be a gross fallacy to come up with any rules to be applied to all of them as a group. For if any child requires an individual evaluation and approach in order to achieve the utmost in his or her development, how much more so in the cases of the handicapped? Since the above is so obvious, I assume that you have in mind the most general guidelines with a wide range of flexibility, allowing for the necessary individual approach in each case. All the more so, since sad to say our present society is poorly equipped in terms of manpower and financial resource to afford an adequate personal approach to each handicapped boy and girl. Even more regrettable is the fact that little attention, or at any rate little in relation to the importance of the problem, is given to this situation, and consequently little is done to mobilize more adequate resources to deal with the problem. Now, with regard to general guidelines, I would suggest the following. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a pretty long letter. I wish I could read the entire thing. Well, let's see how far I can go. Now, with regard to the general guidelines, I would suggest the following. 1. The social worker or teacher and anyone dealing with retarded individuals should start from the basic premise that the retardation is in each case only a temporary handicap, and that in due course it could certainly be improved, and even improved substantially. This approach should be taken regardless of the pronouncements or prognosis of specialists in the field. The reason for this approach is, first of all, that it is a precondition for greater success in dealing with the retarded. Besides, considering the enormous strides that have been made in medical science, human knowledge, methodology, and know-how, there is no doubt that in this area too, there will be far-reaching developments. Thus, the very confidence that such progress is in the realm of possibility will inspire greater enthusiasm in this work, and hopefully will also stimulate more intensive research. 2. Just as the said approach is important from the viewpoint of and for the worker and educators, so it is important that the trainees themselves should be encouraged, both by the word and the manner of their training, to feel confident that they are not, God forbid, cases, much less unfortunate or hopeless cases, but that their difficulties considered as above only temporary, and that, with a concerted effort of instructor and trainee, the desired improvement could be speeded and enhanced. 3. Needless to say, care should be taken not to exaggerate expectations through far-fetched promises, for false hopes inevitably result in deep disenchantment, loss of credibility, and other undesirable effects. However, a way can surely be found to avoid raising false hopes, yet giving guarded encouragement. 4. Part of the above approach, which, as far as I know, has not been used before, is to involve some of the trainees in some form of leadership, such as captains of teams, group leaders, and the like, without arousing the jealousy of the others. The latter could be avoided by making such selections on basis of seniority, special achievement, exemplary conduct, etc. 5. With regard to the efforts which have been made in recent years to create group homes for retarded individuals, which, as you say, has been a source of controversy, it is to be expected that, as in most things in our imperfect world, there are pros and cons. However, I believe that the approach should be the same as in the case of all pupils of students who spend part of their time in group environments, school dormitories, summer camp, etc., and part of their time in the midst of their families, whether every day or at weekends, etc. Only by individual approach and evaluation can it be determined which individual fits into which category. 6. There's surely no need to emphasize at length that, as in all cases involving Jews, their specific Jewish needs must be taken into account. This is particularly true in the cases of retarded Jewish children, yet all too often disregarded. There's unfortunately a prevalent misconception that since you are dealing with retarded children, having more limited capabilities, they should not be burdened with Jewish education on top of their general education, so as not to overtax them. In my opinion, this is a fallacious, and detrimental attitude, especially in light of what has been said above about the need to avoid impressing the child with his handicap. Be remembered that a child coming from a Jewish home probably has brothers and sisters or cousins and friends who receive a Jewish education and are exposed to Jewish observances. Even in the American society, where observant Jews are not in the majority, there is always some measure of Jewish experience or Jewish angle in the child's background. Now, therefore, if the retarded child sees or feels that he has been singled out and removed from that experience, or when he will eventually find out that he is Jewish, yet deprived of his Jewish identity and heritage, it is very likely to cause irreparable damage to him. On the other hand, if the child is involved in Jewish education activities, and not in some general and peripheral way, but in a regular and tangible way, such as in the actual performance of mitzvahs, customs, and traditions, it would give him a sense of belonging and attachment and a firm anchorage to hold on to, whether consciously or subconsciously. Eventually, even a subconscious feeling of inner security would pass into the conscious state, especially if the teacher will endeavor to cultivate and fortify this feeling. I am, of course, aware of the arguments that may be put out forth in regard to this idea, namely that it would require additional funding, qualified personnel not readily available at present. To be sure, these are arguments that have a basis in fact as things now stand. However, the real problem is not so much as the lack of resources as the prevailing attitude that considers the Jewish angle of secondary importance, or less, consequentially, the effort to remedy the situation is commensurate, resulting in self-fulfilling prophecy. The truth of the matter is that if the importance of this would be seen in its true light, that it is an essential factor in the development of the retarded Jewish child, in addition to our elementary obligation to all Jewish children without exception, the results would be quite different. Perhaps all the aforesaid is not what you had in mind in soliciting my views on group homes. Nevertheless, I was impelled to dwell on the subject at some length, not only because it had to be said, but also because it may serve as a basis for solving the controversy surrounding the creation of group homes for those children who are presently placed in an environment quite often quite distant from the individual's home and community, to paraphrase your statement. Finally, a concluding remark relating to your laudatory reference to the Lubavitch movement, with his deep concern for every Jewish individual's welfare, etc. Needless to say, such appreciation is very gratifying, but I must confess and emphasize that this is not an original Lubavitch idea, for it is basic to Torah Judaism. Our sages of old declared that v'ahavta lecha kamecha, love your fellow as yourself, is the great principle of our Torah, with an accent on as yourself. Since every person surely has a very special personal approach to himself, to the credit of the Lubavitch emissaries, it may be said, however, that they are doing all they can to implement and live by this golden rule of the Torah, and doing it entirely and enthusiastically. May the schus harab, the merit of the many who benefit from your sincere efforts to help them in their need, especially in your capacity as regional chairman of the Council for Mental Retardation, stand you in good stead to succeed in the fullest measure and stimulate your dedication with even greater achievements with esteem and blessing, the Rebbe signs. So I did end up reading all of it, so be it. Now, there's other letters where the Rebbe speaks about special children and says it's not just a nice line, but it means, because just as they have, if something is taken, they're given other strings that make them special. There's, of course, also the Sikha in the summer of 1976, where the Rebbe spoke to Mitzuyoni, and he suggested that the soldiers should not be called Nache Yisrael, handicapped or wounded, but Mitzuyoni, the special forces, the special soldiers. Because all emphasizing that the neshama does not get hurt by any handicap, and on the contrary, it has strengths that others may not have. So that covers that topic. Now, with a few minutes remaining, let me just address two more things. One is infertility. But I think I'll leave that because we were looking at people who have asked about infertility support groups. And because I don't have the details, I will wait till next episode to give you more details on this topic. The final question was regarding Chassidus Applied. Here's the question. I was preparing a class based on Likutei Sichos, volume 15, where the Rebbe discusses the difference between Esav and Yishmael, why Esav is considered a Yisrael Mumar. The Rebbe brings in a fascinating story about Chush chopping off Esav's head and it rolling next to Yitzchak, and how this symbolizes that the head of Esav has Gedusha, and it is only the body of Esav that dragged it down. This got me thinking about the question, why do Muslim terrorists have such a fascination with chopping off heads? Perhaps they sense the holiness of Esav and can't stand it and want to chop it off. They sense that too. They sense that those members of Esav are misusing their bodies and they want to release the head. 3, they just killed the whole Jew since don't go into beheading, since the Jew is holy Kaddish. Well, it would make an interesting thought chain for my audience and bring the lesson some relevance, but immediately an objection arose in my mind. My teachers really did not like adding into the Sikh's personal introspections, even if they are prefaced saying that this is just my speculation. So my question is, when is it Chassidus applied? And when does the line get crossed and beyond the bounds of application into the realm of speculation? Or, in another way of putting it, being true to the original or stating one's own ideas. So it's a very good question in general. The beheading thing, I don't know if I would agree, and that's the way to approach it. Absolutely not, in my opinion. You're going to have to deal with decapitation that also exists within Torah if you're going to really be thorough, and someone's going to surely bring that up. But let's talk about the general question, which is my point I want to make. I deal with this issue every week. This is called MyLife, Chassidus Applied. That's a strong statement. It's suggesting that this is Chassidus Applied. I'm not suggesting it's the only way to apply Chassidus, but I'm definitely suggesting that it's Chassidus being applied. How do I have the breitkeit and the chutzpah to do that? Well, this has been the struggle of all of us working in the sichos, where we listen to the Rebbe, and obviously we wrote the Hanocha as the Rebbe said it. Then there comes explaining it. So the thing is that when you begin to learn something properly, and I can't say master it, but you start understanding the spirit of the words and the ideas, you begin to appreciate the methodology. And shgias miyavin, we all make mistakes, but someone who's trained can look at a source and apply it, and you could see it's in the words. And at times it's not in the words, and then you state it openly and say, you know what, I haven't seen this specifically stated, but it appears to me that's the way to look at it. Or you show your sources and then say, here's how I interpret it. So it's all about being transparent and honest and being open. Full disclosure, as they say. And above all, the intention is emes. There are times that you learn something, and I've said things, and sometimes I look back and I say, I don't know if it's exactly what the source was suggesting. And at times, you just feel that is what the source is saying. It's very hard to give examples right here. As I do this every week, I try to bring a source and then explain the source, or say something that's based on how my understanding of different sources. But as I said, human beings are human beings. And I'm happy to hear if anybody has a different interpretation or sees the interpretations that I've brought and cited as being perhaps going too far. I really believe not. I think the whole basis of this Chassidus Applied is based on the Alter Rebbe's introduction to Tanya, that all the answers are there in Chassidus, and you have to go to G'delim Shebe'ir to get, if you can't see the answer itself. So it's about really finding the sources, applying them, and knowing how to interpret them that make it relevant. And there's no question there are times that people go overboard and they give their own ideas, which they're entitled to do, but they should state it. This is my idea. I find that many people fit their own psychological ideas into Chassidus instead of the other way around. You have to look at a mimer, learn it purely, just what the focus of the mimer is, but you can't stay stuck with a cryptic language. You have to apply. What does this mean in my life? And in early stages, until you master the art, so to speak, which may never happen, none of us master it, but you get better at it, what happens is you run it by someone else and says, you know something? That's a word that stims. I read the Maimer in Tere'er or in another place, and it sounds right, it resonates. And the more you do it, Eivas Abiketis, embrace critique, the more you get closer to it. But just to say I'm a smart guy and I have great ideas and then just go find the Maimer and apply things you learned elsewhere into what the Maimer says is not the approach to take. So this takes work. If anybody ever, as I say, has comments on what I've said, I'm more than happy to hear. I'd love to hear. And on the other way around, if you have something you'd like to apply to this, want to run it by me, I'm happy to respond and comment if I think it's something that seems to be accurate to the consistent. Just like you have pshetlach in Rashi or in Gemara, sometimes a pshetlach klingt, it means it resonates, and sometimes it doesn't. So this is something that could be determined and established. I want to add one thing which I missed before about davening. I saw an interesting yechidus of a shliach in Tav Shalamed Gimel. The shliach writes when he was 17 years old, he asked the Rebbe, how do you attain chayis, vitality, in davening? The Rebbe responded the following. I'll translate it. What you write about chayis in davening, so it's known the word from the Siddur Eino, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Medav Tzotel, and you have to divide davening into 6 or 7 sections. And every day from the week, daven, focus on one of those sections. Was das meint nicht kein Pirush HaMilos, not Pirush. Of course you have to daven Pirush HaMilos, interpretation of the words of the whole davening. That has to be every day. Was das meint the Chassidische Teich, to take that section that you divided, the 7 or 6 or 7, and take the Chassidische interpretation, similar to what we heard before, Tzemach Tzedek's words. Taking the Chassidische interpretation, I do this ton, in daven. When you'll do this, you'll have vitality in davening. So I thought that's an interesting thing to say, straight from the Rebbe. That means you can't do the whole davening in this way. So daven the whole davening, the Pirush HaMilas, and take a section. It's similar somewhat, the Alter Rebbe writes in Hilchos Yom Kippurim, that in davening Yom Kippur, better to say one davening, one tefillah of his daf to say, than just say a whole bunch that you don't really have the particular kavanah. Okay. This has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 46. Being that we're going into Yutas Kislev, and we're going into, which is the Chassidus Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus, and it's the beginning of the Shana Teva, Tekaseva, Limud Chassidus, B'teres Chassidus, Darkei Chassidus, the different Lashenis. And Al the Rebbe Rashab called it Zeh Hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha. This became the Ikir Yufutzimay Nasecha, began in Yutas Kislev. And the beginning of this episode, I spoke about Ufaratzta, spoke about the conquest of the world, which Yutas Kislev essentially is the beginning. It opened the door that even the Sarim and even the nations and the ministers all saw the Hifli, how God's wonders in this world. But then it was the early stages of the Alter Rebbe, the beginning, Dera Rishon, the beginning, Miyasa Terech Chassidus Chabad. Now we're in the 7th generation, and we have the cumulative effort of all these 7. So clearly we have the power to do our part to finish the job. And the finishing the job means each of us has an obligation, not just an option, an obligation to bring Elokus into this world. So someone asks you, what's your plan for tomorrow? What's your plan for the next day? Is to bring Elokus into this world. Think about it every morning that way, and do something that way to be Megala Elokus. What means Megala Elokus? That can be being inspiring a Jew to do a mitzvah. It can be your own davening or your own mitzvah. It can be through learning something. It can be through a nice, kind gesture. There's hundreds and hundreds of ways. Megala Elokus means that you don't just do what a regular, secular, weekday, mundane day brings to you. You do something to make the day a little less mundane, a little less materialistic, a little more spiritual, a little more divine. Each of us does that every day. Tell me the cumulative power of that. And we've been told by the Rebbe that we're already at the threshold. We've done our part. It's just a matter of opening eyes, im do'achin kulchem, the last straw, however you want to explain it. But there's something we must all do. So everyone should have Taka L'shana Teva, Tikaseva, and Chassidus, and Teres Chassidus, and Darkei Chassidus, and it should be a year of a Chassidish year, a Chassidish week, and a year that finally, Yefutza Menesecha Chutza, Osimar, the Malka Meshicha. So until next Sunday, episode 47, 8 to 9 p.m. on Sundays, everyone should have a Chassidish Yontif and a Chassidish Good Yontif and a Good Yontif, and Darkei and Chassidus and Limud Chassidus and Midas Chassidus and Anhogas Chassidus.